Okay. Thank you, Dennis. My name is David G. I'm a grateful recovering alcoholic and a grateful recovering sexaholic. Grateful for a recovery date in both programs, in AA of August of 1994 and SA of October 1st of 2019. Really grateful to be here to share experience, strength, and hope with you guys. Thank you for coming out on a Sunday, taking a little bit of time to join us in this book study. We've been covering several weeks of it now, starting at the front of the book over to where we're at now. We're in We Agnostics, looking at step 2. We did a couple of weeks in this chapter, and looks like today we should be able to finish up this chapter. You know, one thing that I've always loved about We Agnostics is it really shows me that it's not about what I believe in. And I thought that for so long. You know, I would sit in meetings, and whenever step 2 would be described, people would always talk about what they believed and how they believed in God. But really, if you look at step 2 real close, it doesn't say anything about that. It says we come to believe that a power, not any power, but that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. And there was something about that one word, that a power versus in a power, that had great meaning for me in the very beginning. You know, they explained to me that if I'm powerless in step 1, then the power that is found in step 2 is my answer. If insanity is driving me out the door to drink and drug and to act out sexually with the behaviors that I was doing for so long, then obviously the answer had to be sanity that's described in step 2. So really, you know, coming to believe that a power, not any power, greater than myself could restore me to sanity is the answer to the whole program. However, if I don't stay in the other 10 steps that support this solution, I will be back into the problem. And that was my experience for years and years and years. Even in Alcoholics Anonymous, I found myself acting out in behaviors that was unacceptable. So, you know, in studying this, we've been taking a look at it in those areas of, you know, our acting out. And it's been a very powerful chapter to do it this way. And I'm so grateful to have had this opportunity to share with you guys. So again, thank you. We've looked at a couple of different exercises in this. We've looked at one on page 46, where we talked about, you know, when enchanted by a starlit night. We talked about that. On page 47, there was an example that we do called spiritual terms, and we looked at that pretty in depth. And so today we want to look at the last exercise in this chapter that was shown to me, and it's right here on page 52, and it starts here, and it's called the bedevilments. And Dennis has a sheet that he's going to put up, and it kind of shows the same thing that the book does. But I really encourage you, if you haven't done this before with a sponsor or with someone you trust, you take some time to get quiet and look at these questions pretty deeply, because this is the unmanageability of our life. This is the reason why I've found that I can't seem to quite step ashore like the book is going to talk about here in a few minutes. And so if you'll look at that sheet there, you know, and we're going to look at it here in the book as well. And starting in the middle of the page 52, where it said we had to ask ourselves why we shouldn't apply to our human problems the same readiness to change my point of view. My point of view of what? My point of view of step 1. As I went through it in this book, it changed. So why would I not have the same readiness to change that point of view whenever it comes to step 2? Obviously, the way that I've been living my life, the way I've been calling on this power has not worked. So I need a new idea. I need something new that is. So let's look at those questions together, and we'll start right there in the middle of the page, and he has it on the screen as well. The first one being this: we were having trouble with personal relationships. They had me to stop right there and take a close look at that. And I needed to ask myself, had I been having trouble with personal relationships? And obviously the answer was yes. But you have to realize when I bottomed out a year ago and came to SA, I'd been in Alcoholics Anonymous for 25 years. So you would think that my relationships by this point would have gotten better. And for the most part, they did. But there was still the disease of sexaholism that was just eating me up. And so there was a lot of personal relationships that I had damaged, not only with other people, but with myself, with a power greater than myself. I had really hurt a lot of people in this area. So I want to stop. I want to take a look at that. And on a sheet similar to the one that he has up there, I'm going to write out how that is. Now, whether you do that or not, I don't know. I just know that that's, you know, if I'm coming through this book and I want to do this work, I'm going to stick as close to this letter as I can, because this is the story of how many thousand men and women have recovered from this disease. And that's what I want. I don't want sobriety, just sobriety. I know how to do that. If all I want to do is stay sober, just don't act out. But if I find that I can't stop acting out once that I stop, then the real problem has showed up. And so my first question being this: we were having trouble with personal relationships. The next one, we couldn't control our emotional natures. Now, there was a big one for me. There's where I really seen the way that I would take advantage of people who were vulnerable, people that were weak, I call weak, that would come into the program. They wouldn't have very much time behind them. They were vulnerable to the prey of people like me sitting in those rooms. And that's something that I'm not very happy to sit here and talk about, but I tell you, it's absolutely necessary for me to be transparent today. I've even talked about this with my wife, and that's something I absolutely would have never done. I've only ever shared this with one person in my whole life until I shared it with her, and today I share it with you, so I have no secrets there at all. Today, I'm not ashamed. You know, I wasn't a bad guy. I was a sick guy. And so this question is going to help me look a little deeper into that. We couldn't control our emotional natures. Look at this one. We were a prey in misery to depression. Look at the word prey. It's almost like a victim. It's one of the few times the book will talk about that. We were a prey to misery and depression. It's almost like that just, it overtook me no matter what. We couldn't make a living. Again, by now, I've been sober in Alcoholics Anonymous for 25 years. I've been in the oil and the gas industry for a lot of years. I've made tons of money. So I didn't see how that question really applied to me. We couldn't make a living. But it was pointed out to me, had it not been for my disease, for my illness, for my acting out, the money that I spent endlessly, could I have provided a better living for my family? Absolutely, I could. So that question, we couldn't make a living, had to come current, not something from many years back. Look at this one. We had a feeling of uselessness. Oh, my God, when I was in the depths of my disease, and even when I first sobered up. And to be honest with you folks, whenever I first come and started doing this book study with you on Sunday afternoons, there was times that I felt this. I just didn't feel adequate to be sharing the book with you as I had learned it. And it took a long time for me to get over that. We were full of fear. And I don't know about you, but I know that in that last week before I was exposed in my acting out, fear had overtaken me. It had taken me to a place where I hope to God that I never have to go to again. You know, please God, whatever it takes, never let me be there again, no matter what it takes. You know, I found myself in the floor just begging for God's mercy. You know, fear had overtook me in a way that I was going insane. Look at this question. We were unhappy. Absolutely. We couldn't seem to be of real help to other people. Not that we couldn't be of help to them. I just couldn't be of real help to other people anymore. I've sponsored guys in the program for over 2 decades now, and it just got to where I could not be of real help to them anymore. And that was really starting to bother me because I knew that the disease of sexaholism, that, you know, it was overtaking me, and that, you know, it was robbing everything in my life. I mean, it was demanding more than it ever had before, and I just didn't have any choice but to give into it. I can remember going to the health department. I had to go to get a test to see if I'd picked up an STD and brought home to my wife. And I get there, and, you know, I wasn't going to go. I was just going to wait to see if something popped up. And there was almost like there was a hand, the small of a hand in my back that was pushing me to go get that done. I get there, I remember talking to the nurse saying, you know what, I'd really love to meet you on different terms than this, but since this is happening this, and I'm like, my God, my ego is even going crazy inside of here. So very, very serious illness that we deal with. And, you know, these bedevilments, and that's what they're called, these things really help me to look at the unmanageability of my life. And you know what, a lot of this stuff has taken place even when I was sober. I mean, I'd stopped acting out. I was trying to live a different life, but for some reason, I just couldn't quite get there. So my mind was overtaking me even while I was sober, which always led to relapse. So the book says, was not a basic solution to these bedevilments more important than whether we should see newsreels of lunar flight? Of course it was. When we saw others solve their problem by simple reliance upon the spirit of the universe, and I promise you, when I came here, I seen that in you. I heard that in you. There are several of you that are on this call today that I heard your stories. And I knew that there was an answer here. I just knew it. But the book says when we saw others solve their problems by a simple reliance upon the spirit of the universe, we had to quit doubting the power of God. Our ideas did not work, but the God idea did. And the only thing that I had to do was be willing to believe. Now, the Wright brothers' almost childish faith that they could build a machine that would fly was the mainspring of their accomplishment. Without that, nothing could have happened. We agnostics and atheists were sticking to the idea that self-sufficiency would solve our problems. When others showed us that God's sufficiency worked with them, we began to feel like those who had insisted the rights would never fly. And that's kind of how I was. I would argue all this stuff. I had all this great knowledge of the book and this, but I could not stay sexually sober for a week at a time. He says, logic is great stuff. We liked it. We still like it. It is not by chance that we were given the power to reason. What a sentence. Take a look at that. Power to reason. I've been given that power. Now notice how he talks about that. Reason, and there's an uncapped R there. Now let's look as we read through it. We're going to see where he starts capitalizing this, and we'll talk about that more as we go. So he says, it is not by chance we were given the power to reason, to examine the evidence of our senses, and to draw a conclusion. That's one of man's magnificent attributes, and I believe it is until we start abusing it. We agnostically inclined would not feel satisfied with a proposal which does not lend itself to a reasonable approach. And if you want a little more information on that reasonable approach then, and the interpretation that it talks about, that can be found on page 48 and page 50 of this book. He says, Haynes to tell why we think our present phase is reasonable, while we think it more sane and logical to believe than not to believe. When we say our former thinking was soft and mushy, when we threw up our hands in doubt and said, we don't know. And I can remember my sponsor early on in AA, he said, there's only 3 words that I want to hear out of your mouth. I don't know. And it was almost like that was the hardest thing for me to ever say, is that I don't know. My ego just did not want to do that. But look at this paragraph, and I think this sums it up pretty much. When we became alcoholics and sexaholics, crushed by a self-imposed crisis, that kind of takes God out of it. I always thought it was his fault, their fault, your fault, anybody's fault but my fault. But the book says, no, we were crushed by a self-imposed crisis. We could not postpone or evade. I can't put this off for a week or two. I can't evade it. I can't run off and come back in a little while and do it. I'm backed in a corner now. And I'm either going to have to fearlessly face the proposition that God is everything or else he is nothing. God either is or he isn't. What is our choice to be? And so if you remember back on page 24, if you'll hold your place on 52 and jump back over here with me to page 24, let's take a look at the squiggly writing here where he was talking about our defense against the drink. And I hear this a lot of times when I come into meetings. Thank God that I have a choice today. But right there in the first full paragraph, he says, the fact is that most alcoholics, sexaholics, not all, but most, for reasons yet obscure, have lost the power of choice in drink. And so I was running around these meetings talking about how wonderful it was that I had a choice today, whether I acted out or whether I didn't. And a man quartered me up and he said, you know what? Who did you ask to keep you sober today? And I said, God. He said, that's your choice. That is going to be your choice from now on. So we find it right there on page 53 where we left off. God is either everything or else he is nothing. What is our choice to be? And if I ask you today what that choice is in your life, I'm quite sure that you would tell me God is everything. But think about the days in your sobriety, and I think about the days in mine where I was miserable, where I was lusting. Now, I hadn't acted out, but I was lusting. I was running the show myself. I was into an argument with my wife. I wasn't getting along well with people at work. There was a lot of stuff going on. On those days, God was nothing and David was everything. My sponsor told me this is not a one and done choice. This is going to be a daily choice that you make. And on the days that David is everything and God is nothing, you're going to struggle. You're going to struggle with lust. You're going to struggle with fear. You're going to struggle with resentment. God is either everything or else he is nothing. Either he is or he isn't. What is your choice to be today? Not one and done. If it was one and done, he would be that choice every day, but my experience shows that that's not the truth. And so I had never looked at that sentence that way. Today, it's a powerful way to take a look at the book and what that's asking. So let's take a bird's eye view of the fellowship when we came here. God, it was wonderful to meet you people. thank you so much for being my friend and reaching out and telling me, you know what, David, I understand where you're at. I understand what you've done. Because I was in a fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous where I was judged for the behaviors that I had done by alcoholics. But you know what? They were right. And so, you know, those were things I shouldn't have been doing. But look what he said. Arrived at this point, we were squarely confronted with the question of faith. Not belief, not trust, faith. We couldn't duck the issue. Some of us had already walked far over the bridge of reason, look at that capital R, toward the desired shore of faith. My ego had let me come to you just a little bit back in 2018. Now the outlines and the promise of the new land, that was the sobriety, that was the recovery that you showed me here. You showed me that there was a way out. And just like the book describes here, it had brought lustre to tired eyes and fresh courage to flagging spirits. I come in with that white flag waving. You know what? I'm beat. I give up. I'm done. I'm done. But look at what he explains in the book, and that's the same thing that happened to me. Friendly hands stretched out in welcome. You people held out your hand. You shook my hand. You gave me a hug. You told me, welcome. We're so glad you're here, David. Come in. Sit all the way down. Stay. Don't leave. But this is what I did. I was grateful that reason, capital R, talking about my ego, had brought me so far. But, and this changes the whole paragraph, somehow it would not let me quite step ashore. It wouldn't let me come all the way in and sit all the way down. I didn't get a home group. I didn't get a sponsor. I really didn't need to work the steps. I'd been in the steps in AA for all this time. I knew the book. I knew the steps. And I walked away from you people and said, thank you, but no thank you. I've got it from here. And in less than a year, I was in worse shape than I'd ever been in my life. And this time I bottomed out and I came back. And thankfully, you know, by God's grace, I've been able to stay. It said, perhaps we had been leaning too heavily on reason, capital R, that last mile, and we did not like to lose our support. And I think that's what happened to me. I felt like I never knew anything other than what my head had always told me whenever it come to lust. And so I couldn't come all the way in at that time. The book says that was natural, but let us think a little more closely. Without knowing it, had we not been brought to where we stood by a certain kind of faith? For did we not believe in our own reasoning? Of course we did. Did we not have confidence in our ability to think? Most of us can say yes. He says, what was that but a sort of faith? Yes, we had been faithful, objectively faithful to the God of reason. That's almost a scary sentence for me to read when I look at that reason with the capital R behind it. I have been faithful to the God of this disease, and I didn't even know it. I didn't even know it. So in one way or another, we discovered that faith had been involved all the time. Faith is one thing, trust is another. I heard a man put it this way. You take a trained gymnastics, you go to watch his show, you see him get up and walk the tightrope with a wheelbarrow going across it. I can sit in that crowd and have absolute faith that that man is going to return to the ground and he's going to be safe. But what about trust? Ask me to get in that wheelbarrow and let him take it up there and wheel it across that tightrope. And you're going to see me back up on that idea pretty quick. And I know that's pretty drastic talking about that, but if I look at that, certain aspects of my disease, I just would not approach the things that I had to do, and I definitely didn't trust in it. So he says, you know, we found that faith had been involved all the time. We found, too, that we'd been worshipers. Boy, it used to make me really angry whenever I would read that in this book. What a state of mental goose flesh that used to bring on. And it still did for a long time until I did that spiritual terms exercise over on page 47 of the book, like we talked about a couple of weeks ago. So look at these questions. Have we not variously worshiped people? I don't know. There have been times in my disease whenever I knew I was going to be caught by my wife, and I just almost worshiped the ground she walked on to keep me out of trouble. If you had something I wanted, yeah, I would definitely, there would be a form of worship there. You know, it wouldn't be real, but it would be there. What about this one? Sentiment, things, money? How about myself? Have I even worshiped myself? Of course I have. And then with a better motive, have we not worshipfully beheld the sunset? I can remember, you know, us taking a look at that one evening out at the lake and watching that sun drop down in the west and just really sitting there almost in a type of a worship. And then before that night was up, I was acting out again. the sea, the flower. These aha moments are great, but they're not enough to hold me as a sexaholic. Who of us had not loved something or somebody? If love was enough to get me sober, I promise you 32 years ago, I would have 32 years of sobriety in Sexaholics Anonymous now. My son was born and he is 32 years old now, almost 30. And there is probably nothing I loved on earth more than him. If love would have been enough, but I remember the day he was being born, I was acting out that day while his mother was in there giving birth to him. This disease is more powerful than the love that I think I have. The only thing that is more powerful than the obsession for me to act out is a spiritual experience as a result of the 12 steps that are laid out in this book. That's the only thing I found powerful enough to break that obsession. How much did these feelings, these loves, these worships have to do with pure reason? See, pure reason. Little or nothing we saw at last. Were not these things the tissue out of which our lives were constructed? And did not these feelings, after all, determine the course of our existence? And I think it's that way today as well, but thankfully we're on a different path. It says it was impossible to say that we had no capacity for faith or love or worship, because in one form or another we'd been living by faith and little else. All the time that had been going on, and I didn't even realize it. Sat with this one for a little bit. Imagine a life without faith. I don't believe that's possible. I don't believe it is in my life. Were nothing left but pure reason, it wouldn't be life. But we believed in life. Of course we did. We could not prove it in the sense that you can prove a straight line is the shortest distance between 2 points. Yet there it was. Could we still say that the whole thing was nothing but a mass of electrons created out of nothing, meaning nothing, whirling into a destiny of nothingness? No way. Of course we couldn't. The electrons themselves seem more intelligent than that, at least so the chemist said. Hence we saw that reason isn't everything. Either is reason as most of us use it, which is entirely dependable. I will entirely depend upon this mind to do everything until I'm beat to the point to where I just can't do that anymore. And that's where I found myself a year ago, thank God. Though it emanate from our best minds. What about people who proved that man could never fly? They were wrong, weren't they? They said that this right had been reserved to the birds, but we know today, many of us, we fly across the country all the time, or we did, a lot of us before this COVID hit. I think really what the book is trying to get me to see more than anything here is, can there be something more beyond what I have believed all this time? And thank God, yes, there can. The book is asking us one thing: belief, decide, and act. And that's what we're going to see as we move out of this chapter. We move into how it works into steps 3 and 4. We're going to look at coming to believe that a power greater than ourselves can restore our sanity. We're going to make a decision in step 3. And we're going to follow that up by action in steps 4 through 12. And when we do that, the book promises that, and my experience is that there is an experience waiting there for me, not only to be sober, but to recover from a seemingly hopeless state of mind and body. It's a beautiful, beautiful process. Well, let's read on. He says, yet we've been seeing another kind of flight, a spiritual liberation from this world. People who rose above their problems. I seen that with you people when I came here. They said God made these things possible, and I only smiled. We had seen spiritual release, but like to tell ourselves it wasn't true. And that's my ego. But actually, we were fooling ourselves, for deep down in every man, woman, and child is the fundamental idea of God. It's already there. I don't have to go looking for that. It's already there. Now, it may be obscured or blocked or whatever you want to call it by calamity, by pomp, by worship of other things. And for me, one of the things that I worship more than anything was lust. I got sober in 1994 in Alcoholics Anonymous, and by God's grace was able to walk away from that life. But I had never been able to walk away from lust until almost a year ago. He says, but in some form or another it is there, for faith in a power greater than ourselves and miraculous demonstrations of that power in human life, which is what you people are as fact as old as man himself. We finally saw, and I think this is where we come to believe, we finally saw that faith in some kind of a God was a part of our makeup. Hell of a sentence there. Part of our makeup. So there's a part of me that is made up of God. And I finally get to see that here. Just as much as we have the feeling for a friend. I had a friend that was an old timer whenever I came into AA, and he was an old man. He had a lot of years, and he was really stern, and he was really strict. But I thank God for that man today. And I can remember, I just hated everything about God. I was new. I didn't like what you guys were reading and talking about in this book. But he was dying, and I went to the VA hospital to see him. And I can remember there was just something from within me that just poured out love on this man. I just loved him in a way that I had never felt love for anybody in my life. And I thought, where does that come from? Because I don't remember having that feeling ever before. And one day I was reading that sentence, and it jumped out at me. We finally saw that faith in some kind of God was part of our makeup just as much as we had the feeling for a friend. And the love I poured out to that friend that day could have come nowhere except from God within. Sometimes we had to search fearlessly, and it tells me right there that I'm going to do step 4. If I want to find this power, right here it's saying step 4 is going to be a part of this. Sometimes we had to search fearlessly, but he was there, and that's where he was once I cleared all that up. He was as much as fact as we were. And here the question was asked back earlier in the chapter, where and how are we to find this power? Well, this is where. We found the great reality deep down within us. And that's why I could never find this power before, because I looked everywhere else. I don't know where I got this idea, if it was taught to me or if it's something that I heard or something that I made up. But I always felt that God was like an elderly gentleman standing on a cloud with a ruler and a chalkboard and all this stuff. I had all these crazy ideas. And I looked in all these other places for God. And when I read this book, it jumped out at me. And I read other spiritual literature as well today, what I call the big book. And it talks about the very same thing. We found the great reality deep down within ourselves. And that's the only place that we're going to be able to find this power. In the last analysis, it is only there that he may be found. It was so with us. I don't really have to analyze this deal anymore. At this point, I've got it. I know where this power is, and I know what I'm going to have to do to go get access to it. Now it's going to be up to me to make that decision and go get it. It's no longer on God. It's no longer on anyone else. The ball's in my court. What am I going to do? The book says we can only clear the ground a bit. If our testimony helps sweep away prejudice, remember those old ideas, enables you to think honestly, encourages you to search diligently within yourself. There's step 4 again. Then, if you wish, you can join us on this broad highway. And if you read the promises on page 75, it's going to talk about this broad highway walking hand in hand with the spirit of the universe. So this is what it's going to take. And it says, with this attitude, you cannot fail. If I'm going to be successful in my recovery, and I do not want to fail here, I promise you, I do not want to go back, then this attitude is what's going to keep me from doing that. Very, very important sentence in this chapter, probably the most important one to me. The consciousness of my belief is sure to come to me. What a beautiful promise. And remember, that was described more on page 27, and on page 62, we will see more of it. In this book, you will read the experience of a man who thought he was an atheist. I stopped there one day at that sentence, and I thought, in this book, I will read the experience of a man. Wonder where that's at. And so I searched and searched and searched in this book to try to find where that was at. It's located in the stories. It's on page 497 in the 3rd edition, and it's on page 208 in the 4th edition. And if you get a chance to go read this man's story, it's pretty wonderful. It really is. His story is so interesting that some of it should be told now. His change of heart was dramatic. I like to look at that as the physical. Convincing, I like to look at that as the mental. And moving, I like to look at that as the spiritual. Physical, mental, spiritual. Our friend was a minister's son. He attended church school where he became rebellious at what he thought an overdose of religious education. For years thereafter, he was dogged by trouble and frustration. You ever been dogged by that? I know I have. Let's look at these questions closely. Business failure, any of us ever had that? What about insanity? Fatal illness, suicide? He says these calamities in his immediate family embittered and depressed him. Post-war disillusionment, ever more serious alcoholism or sexaholism. Impending mental and physical collapse brought him to the point of self-destruction. One night when confined in the hospital, he was approached by an alcoholic who had known a spiritual experience. Remember, we talked about this all the way back in the chapter, There Is a Solution. A lot of people say if people at the meeting wants me to sponsor them, they're going to approach me. But the book over and over and over says that we are the ones who make the approach. And thank God they did that for this man because it saved his life. He was approached by an alcoholic who had known a spiritual experience. Our friend's gorge rose as he bitterly cried out, if there is a God, he certainly hadn't done anything for me. And I've felt that way before myself. But later, alone in his room, he asked himself this question: is it possible that all the religious people I have known are wrong? Now, automatically, my ego wants to jump to that and say, no, of course they couldn't all be wrong. But to be open-minded is to look at both sides of the question. I don't know if all of them were wrong, but they may have been. I don't know that. I just know from my experience, the way that I was living, based on what I had learned from them or what I had heard, it was nothing but wrong, and there is no right way to do a wrong thing. While pondering the answer, he felt as though he lived in hell. I guarantee you many of us could relate to that. But look at how God came to him, how this experience came to him like a thunderbolt. A great thought came. And that's usually where it comes in for me, is a great thought. It crowded out all else. Who are you to say there is no God? This man recounts he tumbled out of bed to his knees. In a few seconds, he was overwhelmed by a conviction of the presence of God. It poured over and through him with the certainty and majesty of a great tide at flood. Man, what an experience. That's beautiful. The barriers, in other words, the old ideas, the prejudice he had built through the years were swept away. He stood in the presence of infinite power and love. Man, what a promise. Now, he had stepped from what I like to call the bridge of reason to the shore of faith. Remember, we looked at that on the last page. For the first time, he lived in conscious companionship with his Creator. Thus, our friend's cornerstone was fixed in place. No later vicissitude has shaken it. His alcoholic or his sexaholic problem was taken away. That very night, years ago, it disappeared, save for a few brief moments of temptation. The thought of drink or the thought to act out has never returned. What a promise. At such times, a great revulsion has risen up in him. Seemingly, he could not drink or act out, even if he would. And the reason why is because God had restored his sanity. Man, what a promise. What is this but a miracle of healing? Yet its elements are simple. Circumstances made him be willing. That was step one. To believe. That was step two. He humbly offered himself to his Maker. That's step three. And then he knew. Now, I don't know what this man knew, but I know what I knew at that point in time when I got to this part of the book. I knew that I was about to make a decision, and I was getting ready to write inventory. Even so, God had restored us all to our right minds. What a promise there, all of us. To this man, the revelation was sudden. Some of us grow into it more slowly, but he has come to all who has honestly sought him. And I think that that's the main thing, is that we honestly seek him. When we drew near to him, he disclosed himself to us. What a promise. So the one thing that I did here, I reviewed this chapter very carefully using the set-aside prayer. God, please set aside everything I think I know about you, me, the 12 steps, AA, recovery, living life, and especially spiritual matters, so that I may have an open mind for a new experience with all these things. And as I read this chapter very carefully, I just continued to say that prayer over and over and over and over. The second thing I did, I got quiet within. The third thing I did was I asked God this question: am I ready to step from the bridge of reason to the shore of faith? And as soon as I felt peace within myself about that question, I was ready to move into the next chapter. Thank you so much for allowing me to share my experience today.